What I'm going to do right at the beginning here is give a little bit of introduction to the research community and what we're kind of up to, or aspiring to be up to. So we're a collective researching paths to an awakening society, and we produce reports, papers, methods, and tools, and we engage in collective sense making, you could say. And for us, I also want to just emphasize that research is a broad term. We don't necessarily mean purely academic level research. We mean systematic, general inquiry, and sense making as well as that. And I wanted to start, though, talking a little bit about the why here. So I think a good place to start would be, imagine we're here. We want to climb this big mountain. Here we are, and we want to climb our this mountain. Now, a question that would kind of come up is like, how do we do that? What mountain, and even what mountain do we exactly want to get to? You know, there's a mountain range over here. Which one do we actually want to get to? Is it this one? Is it this one? Where are we going? Now, we could just set off and start exploring the paths. We could just simply start moving along and just trying things out, exploring different places in the landscape and see how it goes. When we get to the mountain, we could just start climbing the mountain. But it might be good, it might be useful to do a little bit of research beforehand, I think. It would be useful to do that. And maybe others have already explored or done some aerial surveys. Maybe we could learn from them. Maybe there is work on things that might even seem unrelated. Maybe rope making, which once we get to the mountain, we're going to need ropes maybe to climb. Maybe it will be steep. Maybe it will be icy. And maybe there are even general principles that we might want to study, you know, about how glaciation works and has formed the mountains. Maybe what the weather is like at this time of year in the mountains. We want to avoid, you know, bad situations. And I mentioned this is obviously a metaphor or analogy, which is if our interest is as in our case, like crudely, how do we transition to a radically wiser, weller world? How do we go from where we are, not to a slight improvement, not to, as I call it, the iPhone upgrade of capitalism. We don't simply want a slightly larger screen and maybe 3 cameras rather than 2. We actually want something really significantly different. How do we do that? And those questions are, what does that future look like? In some detail, you know, there might be others who, again, we could just set off, we could just form, we could just start trying things out, and we will definitely do that. But it might also be wise to do some research beforehand or as we go along. Maybe others have already spun or done these things, as I said, the aerial surveys. Maybe there's this unrelated work. Maybe there are general principles that we could uncover about this. And so just as a motivation for why is there a research group, because Life Itself does quite a lot of kind of practice, you know, we actually run communities, we put on events, we run courses, we build courses. But it seems to me that, I suppose I haven't done it, it seems to me that it would be important to do research of some kind. And I would also say that this is somewhat neglected in my experience in this for some reason in this kind of area. If you look back at, I would say, even utopian thinking, it isn't necessarily highly associated with empirical research. You know, Marx had a very strong critique of capitalism, for example, but he didn't do a lot of actual studying of how, you know, in fact, I mean, in a good way, he was extremely vague about what this wonderful future was going to look like. I mean, actually, through Marx's works, there's actually only very, very high level and very vague descriptions of how this wonderful future of the proletariat would work, for example. I was giving one example of the more classical utopian thinking, but even in transformative work, if you go out and look at people doing, particularly I'd say in the, maybe there's, you know, you might say there is in clinical psychology, but even take psychology or psychotherapy, Freud didn't, much only psychotherapy did not engage in very systematic empirical research other than case studies. There wasn't like, we're going to do randomized controlled trials or we're going to evaluate stuff. I mean, in fact, it's somewhat notorious now for the way that Freud behaved, and even much later. Even today, when you look at there are huge numbers of personal development programs out there in the world. How many of them conduct rigorous or any kind of research about their methods, their impact, their long-term impact, etc.? I mean, I'll just take one last example that I always think is striking, which is I live very close to Plum Village, which is a wonderful Buddhist monastery. I think, Plum Village as a tradition is amazing, people are highly extraordinary. Thousands, tens of thousands of people have gone to Plum Village on retreat. From talking to the monastics, never, as far as I can tell, have they ever given anyone a survey before and after they left about their experience. Or examined, for example, what size should Dharma sharing circles be? Is it good to have a circle of 6 people or 20? Should you have a mix of people from different backgrounds or the same background? Any of these kind of systematic questions you might ask about the kind of ways that you're doing things and whether they could be better. So it seems to me that this area, and I'm coming a bit more into maybe the focal area, is one that would benefit from research. And that brings me to part 3, which is a little bit more as a research agenda. So if I were to zoom in here, as I say, is what paths do we think are as important? There are many paths up this mountain. There are even different debates about where we're trying to get to. What does an awakening society look like? Or what does this new paradigm look like? Exactly. But what paths should we take? What should we explore? There are many. We're a small organization, again, at Research Life itself, and even in the world, the set of people investigating this kind of stuff relative to those working on, I don't know, AI or how to make a better iPhone is probably small. So we probably have to kind of focus a little bit. And it's also a hard thing about hard things. Paradigmatic transitions that we're talking about are hard and rare. They haven't happened a lot in human history. I mean, norm changes have happened more, and you could study that more. And so I want to say a couple of things about life itself, or at least I want to say here my position. I think I want to emphasize one thing to come back about the community is it is very open. Pretty much any topic that has a clear connection with a wiser, well world is fair game for us. You're welcome to join this community with anything. Probably working on, I don't know, but how to make better tires for the road is not going to be so relevant, but it covers a lot. I'm going to say here a bit more for myself. I take the liberty of being the chair here, a bit more some of the things that I think are particularly interesting. So one is going to start with the primary of being thesis for us, which is we have a belief, or I have a belief, I'm going to say that at the moment, that the paths that are important up this mountain tend to share a primacy of being, i.e. they're going to work on our values, our cultural attitudes, our worldviews, our psychology, and our culture more than it's about technology. If in the simple example I might bring in the climate crisis, solving the climate crisis or things like the climate crisis, collective action problems like that in the long run are not about us inventing better voting mechanisms or even better solar power. It's about how do we cooperate together better. We know what to do, seemingly a lot about the climate crisis, but we're not doing it. Why is that? And I think that goes to our being. So we call this the primacy of being. The other famous illustration of this that I give is the study by Robert Putnam and colleagues about Italy. I don't know if people are familiar with that book published in 1994, which looked at what happened in Italy when Italy decentralized. So in 1975, Italy engaged in a major institutional experiment in which they moved a large amount of budgeting power from the central state to the regions. And Robert Putnam being, I don't know if people have heard of Putnam, he wrote Bowling Alone, invented kind of social capital, is very now famous social scientist. But he immediately went out with his colleagues and said, this is an incredible opportunity to study, a natural experiment. And they collected data for the next 15 to 20 years. And the thing that's interesting for us is you could ask the question, what would happen as you move this power out? This is a structural change. It's an institutional, formal change in who has budgeting control. And what they found, crudely, and to simplify a little, was that the impact of this in the north of Italy, which had strong, you might say, civic culture, was very positive. There was more engagement in society, money was better spent, there was lots of engagement in the budgeting process, blah, blah, blah. But in the south, it basically didn't go very well. It didn't lead to more citizen participation, better decision-making. It led actually sort of just to more corruption and clientelism. And the basic point of this that you could think of was that culture trumped institutions. it's the way of being of the north of Italy, the culture that had existed there, developed over 500 to 1,000 years, was a crucial determinant of what the impact of that formal structural change was. And you could also say this is why Marx is the crude thing of why Marx is kind of mistaken, right? Which is he doesn't have any allowance for psychology; it's all structure. So this is a thesis of life, of myself at least, which is that for our paradigmatic shift, for radical improvements in our well-being or in our social systems, we need to work on the inner dimension, the cultural dimension, as a major thing. It's also highly neglected. Hence the focus on inner development and cultural living and how they relate to wisdom, well-being, and the emergent collective. And I'll also make a little bit of comment again about this for myself, about a research agenda. Some people here, I don't know, people could put their hands up who are familiar with Ken Wilber. Is there anyone here who hasn't, maybe the other way around, hasn't heard of Ken Wilber? In many people haven't heard of Ken Wilber, so that's kind of in itself interesting. But no, not everyone has put their hand up, so I'm going to assume no. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. You can also read this piece on our website about integral spirituality. But one of the things that I think is very intriguing about Wilber, just to finish, and this is going to be a wrap up on this, that is that he talks about cultural evolution. In fact, he shares this lineage of grand visions of at least one kind of cultural evolution, which starts with Gebser or even before. You could go back to Spengler, in fact, and the decline of the West, or before that. There's this kind of tradition of which is, I think, actually really fascinating, which is to start to say, well, there is this grand kind of movement, if you like, underlying in human history of sort of, there is an underlying development of that you can examine in kind of cultural complexity and in cultural values. He's here kind of, Wilber particularly is kind of sort of borrowing his version of it from spiral dynamics and so on, and Claire Graves. And it kind of ties into an ego development model. It's sort of the difference between it at the personal level and the cultural level, you might say, is subtle. The issue about it, I would just put out there, and I think I opened an issue in our forum about this just today, is can you find any empirical data that backs up spiral dynamics? In fact, can you almost find any empirical data that backs up Claire Graves that you can find published? I have struggled. I've also struggled to find any evaluation questionnaire, and Burrs might say that actually you can give to people that would say, oh, if you know these colors, it's made famous in reinventing organizations, for example, which is teal and green and orange and amber and so on. They certainly seem plausible when you look at the world, but no, I don't know of any serious academic researcher that at the moment goes very close to them, for example. And at the same time, I would just kind of give an example of another person we interviewed in our podcast. But if people are familiar with the Henrich book, the Weirdest People in the World, which I think is an extraordinary work, again, in this primacy of being thesis, I think this is kind of a landmark along with Putnam, because this book is basically a straight up primer in the primacy of being. The book is setting out to answer one of the big questions that people always ask, which is like, this previous book answers the first one, which is why Homo sapiens? Why did we make it? What's special about Homo sapiens? For good or ill, we kind of dominate the world's ecosystem. We're more successful than any other species, and a variety of metrics of success that we might not like, but you know, with so on. But this one answers the other question: why the West? Why, by a group that in 1000 AD didn't seem to be anywhere in the leading societies of the world, come by like 1900 to dominate the world? And this book is a straightforward primacy of being answer, in that he basically says what happened crudely is the Catholic Church had this weird rules about intermarriage with your relations. It had a very unusual set of bans on marrying your cousin, and on general not having multiple wives. For example, it banned polygamy. This is actually very unusual in looking at societies over human history. And this had a massive impact in that basically it completely took the West on an unusual route, where it eliminated the traditional kinship network model of most societies. Most societies are oriented around kinship networks, and their trust systems are built around kinship networks. And basically you have a large amount of in-group trust, but you have low out-group trust. And in the West, because you basically trashed that from about 500 AD onwards with the Catholic Church, who just banned these things, by the way, for religious reasons. They didn't have any of this intention. It led to a real change in society, which was much more horizontal, had much more out-group trust. So, for example, if you're aware, the West today still kind of scores the highest on most measures of trusting strangers in the world. People, believe it or not, people in America, you might not think that, but people in America, people in the Netherlands, people in Sweden, people in Western Europe basically have the largest level of stranger trust, people trusting people who are not from their culture or society in the world, for example. And this meant, crudely, I would argue that the West was better at often solving collective action problems, at least at some level, for example, paying taxes. One of the great breakthroughs of Britain was ability to raise much higher levels of tax revenue in a representational government, in democracy, all of these kind of stories. And you know, it predicts loads of other stuff. The book is fascinating, you know, like cheating, what people in the West cheat less on anonymous tests and things like that. And that's a straight up incredible story of how a cultural setup led the West down this really unusual cultural evolutionary path, and then had this huge impact on certain outcomes, you might say. And this is, I don't know, I think this is an example of how you can start making cultural evolutionary work rigorous. That hasn't happened prior to the last 20, 30 years. We didn't have the data. Mark will know this, obviously, the revolution in social network analysis that happened when we had large social network databases. But that's also, first of all, happening in other areas. For example, there's a paper to finish by Henrich and his kind of colleagues. He's got a whole industry of people now. He's got a Harvard lab showing that culture boundaries are not just like arbitrary. French and Germans have radically, quite significantly different interests. If you just take Facebook data and you look at people's interests and you do principal component analysis and you cluster people, French people are really quite different from Germans and quite different from Spanish and so on. You know, there are genuine these cultural differences between groups, for example. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. He's got a load of data. I mean, the most fascinating part of that book, I will finish at this point, is that you can really correlate the amount of Catholicism you experienced as an area at a really low geographical level with performance, like the number of patents you get in 2010. You can do things like how much time you spent with the Catholic Church between 1500 and like 500 AD and 1600 with outcomes today, i.e. long-term cultural impacts of these kind of institutional structures impacting culture. So to finish that, it's also an exciting time. More Catholicism, more patents. So it leads to basically more innovation because of higher trust and other stuff. It's because more Catholicism meant ultimately more Protestantism. Protestantism is even better, right? Because it leads to literacy. Protestantism is like the best of all, because then you get literate. Like everyone gets literate. You're more individualistic. And by the way, to end this story, and this relates back to Wilbur, other stuff, which is there was something wonderful that we now don't like about modernity. So modernity is sort of birthed out of the weirdest people in the world, right? A lot of the things that are wonderful about that group, they're hyper individualistic, you know, like they have high trust, etc. They have all these kind of aspects about them that make them quite special. For example, they engage in the fundamental attribution error, which other societies don't. Also is their weakness, you say, right? Like a lot of the challenges that we see today are that we're hyper individualistic, you know, we're disconnected, we're lonely, at least in, you know, most kind of more quote unquote developed, you say, Western societies. And this is the story of these great cultural waves going back to Wilbur that you could say, which is that these, as a given major cultural wave starts out, it's highly productive. Think of the original version of Christianity. But at some point, it becomes kind of exhausted. It becomes decrepit. It becomes corrupt. Think of the Catholic Church in 1300, you know, selling indulgences. It's no longer a force for innovation as it was under the Roman Empire. Similarly, modernity, which was this incredible breakthrough with individualism, with autonomy, with, you know, human rights, with all these things, is now maybe locked in the trap of individualism and endless kind of capitalist growth or whatever you want to put on the list. And that's at these moments, that's when you're waiting for some new paradigm to be birthed and what it looks like. What does it look like? How does it come about? How does it get encouraged? So to end, I'm just going to finish with a couple of research questions. So it would be amazing to have a database of case studies of major value changes or even paradigm shifts of the past. How did slavery get abolished? what were the cultural or ontological aspects of the abolition of slavery? How did veganism or gay rights happen? How did modernity happen in general? There are very few cultural histories relatively of modernity compared to like economic histories of technology. How did these things happen? Other examples is more work on the primacy of being thesis. I know of the weirdest people in the world. There's a book called Albion Seed, which is about the US by David Hackett Fisher, which is also an extraordinary work showing of the cultural impact of different groups moving from England. But more work like that on the primacy of being thesis, because it is not widely accepted. And finally, obviously, the big one is, what about the personal level? What does adult development look like? Is it adult development? What are the lines of healthy human development beyond childhood? What is the, if you like that term, ontogenetics of it? What are the things that contribute to it? What are the protocols, the processes, the environments, the practices that support healthy human development? For example, we all know for children that if you don't expose young children to language, after a certain point, it will be very difficult for them to acquire language. What does that look like in terms of how do you acquire second person perspective? What do you have to be exposed to? When? What kind of practices support that processing? I'm going to pause at that moment in this introduction to that. Thank you very much. And it's kind of a question and discussion time, and a discussion of some of the things that it's setting out. Many other people in other sessions will have some other talks by people setting out the kind of different directions we're interested in. Which I've met multiple, because, for example, I know Lyubov is here. We have other areas, and I should actually, I should have ended. I just paused, sorry. I will have one last thing, which is we have an overall topical map that you can find on our research community page. I don't know. You can see it where there's some kind of onto stuff. And again, we're interested in things beyond this, but you might call it how do paradigmatic transitions happen, the ontological stuff, and future systems design, which is comes up to some extent. So these are obviously vast areas, and we are very aware that we need to focus, and we're at the moment in the discussion amongst the community of people. Obviously can start any project they would like, but is there particularly some core projects we would like to begin on? So with that, I'm going to come to questions or discussion. Just people can talk about whatever they would like, or ask questions or suggestions based on that. Pavel, please jump in.
Just to clarify, is the idea to explore how massive transformation of cultural norms is happening? It's like you want to take a few case studies to explore that? Is that the basic idea behind the research, or do you have anything more specific in mind, or is
well, at the moment, so just two suggestions. I'm trying to put out there some example research questions that we would examine, that we could examine the community. And obviously, to some extent, this is a self-organizing community, so people are going to look at what motivates them. I mean, I gave that as a simple example. I mean, I got a case study written by one of our kind of research interns a couple of years ago. That's about slavery, because obviously it's a kind of quite a studied question of like, why did slavery get abolished? But it would be a good example, because just today, as I said, there's quite, I would say at one end, like there's quite a lot of like hand waving. Like if you ever read Wilbur, like there are moments would be like, on the eve of the American Revolution, 20% of people in the United States were like an orange or something like that. These kind of like incredible statements about where he's making this argument that that's how major transitions happen. But it would be lovely to kind of even have anecdotal evidence of that. What could let's read some of the founders' letters and see that. That's one example. So it would be an interesting. I mean, I'm slightly here throwing out ideas at this point as a group. I think we're going to focus down, but I could get more specifics. That's one example. I mean, another example I've actually thought would be very fascinating at the moment would be to try and take. There's quite a well-known open database of political manifestos that you can get, of political manifestos of every country from like 1945. And you can do textual analysis on it. And one of the interesting things would be like, okay, are there shifts in values? I mean, this is more like world value survey stuff, but are there like signs of people becoming like teal or orange or something like that? You know, these are other examples. I mean, my other big pet one is there is this world value survey database, which has been, I don't, people know like Engelhardt and the Engelhardt map, you know, but what about that tends to, I'd say, kind of max out towards green, like the things that it talks about, like self-expression values are sort of him noticing the beginning of like beyond orange. But you could take that data set, which is quite rich, and try and analyze it in a principal components way, you know, to look at more other things that might be showing up, you know, particularly maybe small groups that don't show up so bigly in the map, but which are kind of pioneers of the future. These are these kind of directional ideas that would I think could be interesting.
Can I kind of
yeah,
maybe
please
also express my interest in the form of a question, also maybe partially. So when we talk about cultural evolution, I think there are different magnitudes, let's say. So it's one thing to change a relatively small cultural norm when we talk about it, for instance, fashion or new meme that is kind of getting spread, right? Slavery is a different thing, which is already like a set of norms. It's like a cultural institution, essentially, the political institution. And then I think the third magnitude would be what we can call world order, in a way, like the way humans live, like a shift from feudal states to capitalism, for example, or agricultural stage to industrial stage. Or I think even more interesting is the stage of nomadic cultures to permanent human settlements. Like why and how was it happening? And there are different theories about it, but of course this was not just a single move. It was like a complete revision of the lifestyles and ways of being for entire human populations. Now asking why we might be interested in that, why I'm interested in that is because I think the magnitude of change that needs to happen in the next 50 years, I think the closest analog would be a transition from nomadic states to agricultural societies, but let's say the reverse order, kind of remembering something that our hunter-gatherer ancestors knew, but we kind of forgot on the way. And now we cannot go back to that state of being, so we cannot go into rewilding, but we need to discover a totally new way of being, which cannot existed before. But moving to regenerative economy and regenerative cultures and integral ways of being is a massive transition.
Massive.
So so my question that I'm holding is how is it possible at all to accomplish that magnitude of change intentionally and within literally within a lifetime of a human being? Because that's what we are tasked with. That's our challenge, and that task, I think, has not been accomplished before ever in human history. So that's where I think we need to look into shifts that have been foundational, that kind of revise the whole way of being for large human population. And that's where I think is interesting, not just the shift in cultural norm that has been described, I think, in a lot of literature, but something that involves so many norms coming as a package. And that's where I think we have to look at.
I mean, others could speak, and please do. I mean, I think you asked a lot of questions. I mean, one I think just a very small comment is of the spiral, which is we can't go back, but we can often why I love the image of a spiral is that you're looping forward, but you might look like you're similar to something like before. You know, you mentioned this point about we're not going to go back to nomadic, but we can there might be things that we're coming back around the loop. We're above something from before. I think the bigger question, I think there are questions. So you describe like this kind of like these levels, as you said, of memes, we could call it, or cultural components. And I agree with you basically that we're focused on the larger one. I think that just because sometimes, I guess I have a thesis that some parts might aggregate, like you can even learn from the smallest level might inform stuff about like how slavery got happened, and then how a big one. And when you say that, and again, I'm really happy there's a literature I'm not like as familiar with, but I don't know of that much. Like when I sent this guy out who was, an Oxbridge graduate in history and said, hey, what is there on like mentalities around slavery? Like the change in mentality in it and how that showed up. It wasn't like there was, there's a really rigorous, for example, has someone gone through a database of the parliamentary debates? Take the parliamentary debates in England and just be like, look at the language that was being using, and like, were people having different mentality, different ideas, and was that somehow shifting it? Some arguments are it's economics, right? People didn't need slaves anymore or something. There's a variety of factors, of course. So I do think that even understanding like cultural norm shifts at like an empirical level, like a relatively good empirical level, would be actually very helpful. And again, like just like this, like for example, there's a literature right on revolutions, or like what percentage of your population need to be engaged and stuff. I know it's not like amazing, that literature. I mean, we don't have a lot of data, right? We just don't have like, and I emphasize this. And to go back, Henrich, when I was on the interview with him, it's like culture's a reticular bush, right? It's not quite a genetic tree. It's more like bacteria, because you can recombine, right? It's more like a phylogenetic tree where you can recombine. And just to take one example again from his book, I don't know whether I think it's in the Wisest People. He's got this, the Ilahita. He's got this one example I think is really great, because it's a documented study of cultural borrowing, where there's basically this tribe in Papua New Guinea, and they're worried about getting their ass kicked by this other tribe, like, which hasn't yet come for them, but it's like a few valleys over, and it's like invading people or growing a bit. And this group kind of send off some like older people to like go check out this other tribe, and they kind of come back and be like, oh, they've got this god, and this god has this stuff, and basically they do this borrowing, they do cultural borrowing. They're like, we're going to incorporate this kind of ancestor god and stuff, but they kind of even mess up the cultural transition of it. One of the funny things about the story is they don't really copy completely accurately. And from a more like religious functionalist perspective, which is of course the perspective of Henrich, i.e. religions, not whether they're true or not, but what is the cultural function? What is the social function they perform? This new religion they invented was incredibly effective in basically, one of the things it did was it made different family groups have to intermingle with other family groups. And what the effect of it was, long and the short of it was, by introducing these new initiation practices and a bunch of other stuff, they were able to scale their Papua New Guinea tribe to unprecedented size. So most Papua New Guinea tribes don't make it past 300 or 400, like the classic size. Once they hit like much over Dunbar, they kind of fracture into two communities. But these guys got to like a few thousand, and they kind of became invincible, because this new cultural pattern they had, which was basically about collective rituals. And they had this ritual where basically they had these like, this group would like do stuff with, brothers would do stuff, but then brothers would mix with other family brothers, and they'd have this like 6 levels of mixing, which created really strong relationship bonds, which basically allowed this community to scale, which is a good example. Boaz likes talking about like collective practices and community practices. So, this is one very concrete example. You can kind of study the cultural evolutionary tree, but I don't know of many stories like that. Like, I don't know of many like studied examples, and there may be lots, I just don't know of them. But that's kind of, that example would inform you quite a lot about what maybe not how you design it, but how these things come about. So anyway, I know we're actually at the hour, and people should feel free to drop at the hour, but I will happily stay on in here if people want to stay on for any longer, and I'm going to talk less at this point and open the floor to anyone else who'd like to share.
Just want to say goodbye. Thank you, everybody. Very nice to meet you, Ollie, Pavel, and Dion as well. See you again soon.
Thank you so much, Boaz.
I also have to leave, so if anyone wants to take on writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and next week, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe just to end, for people who need to leave, if you're interested in joining or participating in the community, there's a good discussion forum, just to say, on GitHub actually. And if you're interested in joining, we actually have weekly calls. We have this once a month, but we also have, if people are interested and are recommended by someone else, we'll have a more weekly call. You don't have to join it, but it is like, it's not like there's an obligation on every week. But if you want to get more actively involved over time, please let me know, and there's an option to come to that, where we meet more regularly and actually do more work and plan out the work plan and so on, whereas today is more an introduction to what we're up to. Ollie, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Rufus. Really enjoyed the presentation you gave there. I think there's a lot of really, very thought-provoking, stimulating stuff. So quite a glad to have joined. Quite an interesting first session. I'll try and come when I can. Fridays is normally my do my own thing day where possible. There's something I've been thinking about recently that I feel like there's a tangent here. I don't know if I'm when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail, because it's kind of my current preoccupation. I don't know whether I'm applying it too readily. The sort of the way we conceive of our interventions leading to change in a linear way. I've got these ingredients, I've got this end in mind, I'm going to do the following activities. Those activities will produce some outputs, and those outputs will lead to outcomes. Those outcomes will feed into higher order goals, this monodirectional thing. I'm wondering, and how that, I think, routinely is proved distinctly unhelpful for kind of system innovations. And I guess the turn away from linear thinking as part of a broader turn in general. But when we think about cultural evolution or cultural, changes in cultural norms, I guess traditionally when we're looking at this history, because perhaps of the slowness of change, what we're looking away from, whether it's a bacteria or a tree, and I think both sort of heuristics are quite instructive and quite illuminating in different ways, but there's this kind of pre-existing path, and then there's a branching away therefrom that represents this kind of new evolution, this new thing happening, whether it's the Papua New Guinea tribe branching off into a new one, or the kind of the current thinking about slavery forming a sort of breakaway thing that eventually becomes the dominant path. This branching as the result of an intervention. If that's the sort of context here, and we think about this linear thing, typically we've had a static conception of the branch as it is that we're branching away from. So this angle is quite fixed, if you like, right? Like there's the norm, and then there's our thing that we're going to do about here, and it's going to create this splinter. I was quite interested a while ago, and I think you kind of touched on it with the iPhone upgrade of capitalism thing. This the way that probably very much to Marx's disappointment, we haven't had this kind of contradictions lead to crisis, inevitably we roll on into the next paradigm, but that capitalism just keeps sort of sustaining itself. There's endless iPhone upgrades. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Like this it changes a little bit, but really just asserts itself more and more and more. That process of it changing as a way to depower interventions, to co-opt interventions, to decelerate them, to flatten them, is happening at such speed now, where there's such an ability. Every time there's sort of, we want to create a cultural shift, we want to create a new norm, we want to branch away from the norm. The main tree, call it capitalism, call it sort of the dominant cultural status quo, immediately responds and does this a little bit, or looks like it does this. The thing that we're moving away from in culture is so amorphous, so intelligent, in quite a dark way, that it's really difficult to imagine this sort of I'm going to intervene, we're going to branch away from culture model. That we kind of need some and this is where I'm really kind of getting lost in the thought, we kind of need some quantum model of cultural evolution that can intuit the way that our intervention doesn't just cause a breakaway, it actually causes the whole system to shift, and that small little factors can kind of placate the motivation that led to that initial branching. And the bacteria is this kind of constantly shape-shifting thing. I'm struggling to put words to it, I guess. It's just that this model of cultural evolution needs to somehow integrate the breakneck speed sensitivity of the existing system to any attempt to deviate from it.
I think the two parts that, just if I can recreate what I think I heard you were saying, which I think is really interesting, is that I think there's one part which is the existing system. Like, if you like, this goes back to the kind of memeplex that Pavel was getting at, or like there's kind of like clustering of stages, right? Like, how do I put it? Maybe analogy is with speciation, right? That there's obviously some point at which species is kind of, changing a bit. It's getting a bit more like X, but it's kind of still human or something. Or it's still, at some point, we know like Neanderthals and human, speciation. There's two things which can reproduce, and then at some point they kind of can't. Somehow things kind of become, and they're kind of stable in some regards, right? There's some point you might imagine there's quite a big switch. So something I kind of get at is there's something like capitalism can be quite stable. Like there can be deviations, like there's veganism, but it's kind of McDonald's will have a vegan meal. It's like it'll kind of be incorporated into the system. It won't. And there's some point there's a kind of phase transition at some point, right? I mean, the other that may be another example. Water's getting colder and colder, and mostly it's still water. It's kind of colder, but it's the molecules. At some point, though, it switches to freezing. And it's probably true that these kind of large mean-plec transitions, I think, are a bit non-linear in that way. Like it in some ways it's gradual, but at the kind of edge, there's something quite rapid tipping happening. And this again, where I feel even writing kind of quite journalistic style stories about this, I kind of would like to. The one I always bring up is like, if you went back to let's pick like 1470, 1480, yeah. So Gutenberg invented the printing press, 1450. And Luther's about to happen, right? 1517 or whatever. I'm getting my dates right. Catholicism would have seemed very monolithic. Like anyone, like the last person who tried to do Luther, I think it was Hus, right? Got invited, in theory, under protection to a meeting and then was executed. Like there's been multiple attempts to have like alternative, to break out of Catholicism, to have stuff that will look like Protestantism. They've all been repressed. At that point, it would lean like, Catholicism, the feudal structure, Catholic feudal structure seems pretty like here to stay. If you'd sat there in like 1470, 1480. And yet, in 1517, we're like within a couple of decades, something that had been there for 1,000 years was basically like completely disrupted. And now, of course, at the beginning, it was almost like chance, right? It just happened that Luther, basically some German princes had a beef with the Holy Roman Emperor, right? I mean, the kind of story roughly is, it's like Luther wasn't that original, his complaints, right? It's just like, but this time, some of the princes were pissed off with the Holy Roman Emperor, so they were like, we're not going to really hand Luther over, we're going to kind of protect him. And then the genie was out of the bottle. Once there was sort of like, people were like, and it's true that maybe there'd been enough cumulative people who were fed up with corruption in the church and this and that, but it's the other thing I always think is that part is unpredictable. I mean, it's why I don't know, Pavel, whether we'll make it in the next few, the best probability is there's going to be a dark age. That's the best guess, right? Like if you look at where we are and our human ability to move the car and how fast we're going, unfortunately, the best guess is a dark age. Well, or we all die with AI, right? Like, we can't sort that collective action problem out either. But, in terms of transition, though, I always think you're going to be hopeful because when you look back in these moments, you never know where you are. I mean, the other example, I think the other way around is, did people know William Irwin Thompson, who with the Lindisfarne Institute? So like he was really ahead of his time. He had all the people coming in the 70s, right? He started in 1973. Like he had everybody who's anyone. He had Bateson, Jeffrey Bateson was his fellow at the beginning. He totally nailed it. He knew Gibbs, he knew everything. And you read his memoir, he sadly died. Like his son is Evan Thompson. But his memoir was quite sad because kind of he was ahead of his time. He never could kind of get the institute properly funded. He never got to build. He built this whole they wanted to build this whole temple out in not Arizona, and it's quite a tragic story in a way. You read it, it's a bit like, I mean, it's not tragic because he did do a lot of things, but it's kind of like he was ahead of his time. And you never know. We don't know whether we're ahead of our time, But the thing is, these things are unpredictable, and I think that the inspiration of feudal to modernity, because in a way, Protestantism is really one of the moments along with the Renaissance, the beginning of modernity, right? Protestantism is the path to individual questioning. Remember that moment, your belief in God is way more important than anything else. I mean, just how radical it was to say to people, no, it's not the church that's going to save you. This is eternal salvation or damnation. And up to then it was like, you're a good Catholic. And suddenly, my God, you're on your own. Sole fides. Only by faith alone in your personal faith and action are you going to get saved. And if you're Calvinist, oh, it's even worse. Anyway, I've got to go off on a bit of a one, but Pavel, you got to jump. But yeah, I think that these meme plexes can seem very sticky, but you never know when you can jump to the next one. And on that note of hope, we maybe should wrap up at least the next 4 minutes. So if anyone else has got questions, they should ask them in the next 4 minutes, and then we will.
I have to
You
go.
go,
But
Pavel.
thank
you
you.
so much.
We'll hope to talk to you again. Bye, guys.
Yes.
I stayed on just to indulge myself, but I'm actually 10 minutes late
You
for a class.
jump now. We should end now. That's so great. If Dion wants to introduce himself or say anything, I would love to meet you, Dion. But yeah, please, Ollie, thank you so much. And until next time.
Sounds good. Pleasure to meet you all. Hope to see you again. Thanks.
Dion, welcome. Matt, if you need to drop. But it's great to meet you. Where are you based?
I'm in California, so it was a bit early for me, but yeah, all great stuff. You know, I mean, big topics. I, of course, don't feel qualified to, you know, talk about these things or think about these things much, but you know, we talked a lot about superstructure trying to change, and you know, I'm maybe trained or have a degree in talking about infrastructure, urban planning.
Wow.
And so that, you know, I'm getting into that role. So that's what I always think about is, you know, how much our infrastructure shapes our beliefs. And we like to think that we can develop heuristics and mental models to supersede anything any infrastructure. But I really do think, you know, just like technology shapes our behavior, roads shape our behavior. And so, I mean, that's maybe an area of hope for me, that if we change the physical infrastructure, we can create a lot of change. And you know, in so many areas of the world, we have housing issues, and that it seem kind of intractable. And so, you know, they're very difficult situations, but I have hope that those can shift, can have that critical mass effect that you're talking about, that once we start to address these issues and bring, you know, maybe more people into higher stages of development, whatever you want to call those stages, that we really can get the ball rolling. But, you know, that's my general thought from everything that was said. But more conversation is needed.
Matt, please go. First of all, Dion, I was going to say thank you so much for sharing. I really resonate with that. Matt, please go ahead.
Hey. Yeah, nice to meet you, Dion. Yeah, I was just, as you were talking about, you know, looking at the history of all this stuff, it kind of made me think about the other side of this, which is like the present moment, and how, you know, I think a lot of people have an intuition that we're kind of on the brink of this, and you bring some of these stories to people and people connect with them so strongly. And I'd be really curious, like, you know, how much of that intuition is real, like what research is out there that kind of points to this being something that's alive right now. What are the signs of it? What does you know, how is it evolving as well? It's like an intuition that I think people have started to connect with in recent years, but maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it wasn't the same. But I don't know, like how much of that's a bias and how much of that's reality. So that's kind of the other side, I guess, of this historical analysis. It'd be interesting to look at the present moment too.
Yeah. I mean, I think also a really interesting point that connected with what Ollie was saying, which I didn't get to, is that the other thing about cultural systems, obviously, maybe compared to genetic, is there's like, they're kind of conscious. So groups can, you know, the existing system can sort of act back, you know, in maybe a way we wouldn't want so much. But there's also a kind of circularity in the sense that if people believe that now is a time of transition, a lot can happen, right? That's why I think the language of hope that people have been sharing here is also so essential, because in a way, if we all believe it's not possible, then it isn't possible. But if we all believe it is, or a significant number of people believe it is, then it is. And I think, you know, there's that great phrase, you know, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was persuading you he didn't exist. I always remember that from The Usual Suspects. But I think always sometimes a joke, I don't know if you, whatever you're feeling about capitalism, but the greatest trick capitalism ever pulled was persuading you there are no alternatives. So that aspect of believing and seeing alternatives is really important. And I think the other point, Matt, is that we don't need, you know, in a way we have to have faith in a concrete sense. I don't think we can know exactly, other than a historical perspective, were you Jan Hus or were you Luther? That's partly chance. But I think that I think it's true that you can notice certain things, which I don't know, in the piece I also wrote with Bjorman, and I'd like to document this more, but I think there's a clear sense, you know, I'm 42 now, but 20 years ago, people didn't like I don't know, you would call it neoliberalism or just how things were, but it was kind of okay. You know, the world was going to move to democracy, you know, okay, Tiananmen Square hadn't gone well, but everyone would, you know, rush, it would all work out. You know, people are really like aware that something is not working. And I think that, you know, in that famous Buddhist stage, right, you need to recognize suffering. You know, there's recognition in there's suffering. Then there's encouragement. You need to investigate. And often people shy away from that. It's like, oh, I've got something, I'm going to try and ignore it. But the next stage, it's too present to ignore. Then you start delving in. Oh, this suffering isn't, I'm not just lonely or depressed, or it's kind of systemic. I think that's the next stage for people. It's like, oh, you know, the other metaphor, you know, there's a crack in the wall of my room on the 50th floor of my skyscraper. I start out just patching it with some paint and some cement. And then at some point I'm like, no, this is foundational. There's something in the foundation. And then there's, in Buddhist, remember, there's the third turning is realization. You know, that I see suffering, I see the source of suffering, and I see that there's a path out of it, or that, you know, there's that. And I think that moment of hope. So it's like that. And then again, to go back to the hub where you are in Bergerac, part of that is also to be with suffering. It's quite hard. A lot of the thing that we shy away from, if you confront the state of the world as it is today, it's kind of shocking. You know, it's kind of scary. You know, it can make you despair for obvious reasons about what we've done to ourselves, to the planet, to other species, the path that we're on, you know, but you need to kind of go through that. You know, it's like, you know, even in a person in Buddhism, you could be like, oh my God, there's just suffering, there's pain, I'm going to die, you know, Buddha, you know, I'm going to die, I'm going to get illness, I'm going to get old. But you have to kind of confront that to get to the point of the hope, you know, somehow. And then there's that path. I think that the hopeful point I almost have is that you can clearly see a lot of people are confronting that something is deeply not working. I think the percentage of people in that, you know, is now double digits in you know, the US, Western Europe, other parts of the world. There's a, you know, I don't know yet where we are on the next stage of that. And that would be great to see data on, you know, somehow collect survey on, you know, okay.
Yeah, and it's shifting so rapidly. I mean, yeah, I resonate with so much of what you're saying. The whole primacy of being thesis is not something I've heard of before, but it's something I definitely feel that, and I come to like similar conclusions to that. And yeah, this sense of like there's a pressure building up, and maybe it looks from some angles it looks like things aren't changing, but the pressure's building up. And you know, at some point this you know, self-healing mechanism that Ollie was talking about, this kind of adaptive mechanism, it's not going to be able to contain that anymore. And as soon as those cracks start to break, you could imagine shift happening quite dramatically and quite quickly. And yeah, we don't know when that will happen, and maybe we don't know exactly what that looks like. I think people are starting to get a sense of the flavor of what's emerging, maybe, but it's still very kind of amorphous and abstract. But yeah, just connect so much with a lot of these topics.
Well, I really, I should close. This is such a joy in life. And I think it is true that yeah, something is happening. You know, I like that song also from John. Something is happening here. We don't know quite what it is. You know, I don't know, Mr. Jones. I always love that track, you know. And I think something is happening here. And I think you also, just to finish, you identify that I would say at a core level, we're now at that stage one. Something's wrong here. The climate crisis, the like other things, whatever, you know, inequality, people. But that next point of what is the source of that? Like that would be an interesting survey question, I guess, to ask people to be like, okay, do you just think it's like we need more wealth distribution, or is there like something fundamentally wrong in our economic systems. You know, that would be an interesting measure of like where people are at, you know, and you know, so on. So Dion, we'll capture that. I think that will be in the things. I think Lyubov's got that. And as I said to people, please you can message me. I think you can find me on the general chat if you're on our WhatsApp community. But the discussion forum, I'll post the last link if you don't know about discussion forum that we have.
Yeah, and actually, Matt, that's for you also, because I couldn't add you, right? So I think you should check how to add this.
You should request access to the research group.
Yeah.
That's what he has to do. Okay. And Dion, there's a discussion forum. People are very welcome to just follow along, participate, and really emphasizing as well, you do not need to be any kind of expert here. Like that's one of the big traps. Everything is welcome. We will make you right. That is my promise. Anyone's contribution, we welcome it. So yeah. Thank you. I just want to say thank you everyone for being here today, those including
Yes.
And Lyubov, anything more
Thank
you'd like to close out?
No, just thank you for leading for facilitation, Rufus, and thank you for coming as well. See you, Matt, in 2 hours or in 4 hours. I will come back to the Iraq and see you, Dion. Really glad to chat more because I'm working on urban projects as well. So I'm really happy to connect later. Ciao.
Thank you. Okay, folks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Matt. Bye, John.